Hello, 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 and welcome back to our weekly Sunday school lesson. I am Elder Latanya Milliken of the All Nations Church in Oakland, California. My pastor is Bishop Terrence L. Milliken, and this is lesson 2 of our winter quarter. The date of our lesson is December the 11th, 2022, and we're in 2 Samuel this week. The 7th chapter will be highlighting the 4th through the 16th verse. Our subject, God's promise to David. It's a great lesson. Before we get started, I want to just wish each and every one of you a happy celebration in whatever you're celebrating, whether it's a birthday or anniversary or engagement. It is the time to celebrate. We're in the month of December, a lot of holiday parties. Take it slow, take it easy, but enjoy because it is a time to celebrate. So with that said, I've got a few birthday shout outs, but they can wait till next week. So let's just jump into our lesson this week. And so I want to just kind of hop back to last week. That was a great lesson. We talked about Elizabeth and Zacharias was the high priest, and him and his wife Elizabeth were praying for a child, a son, and time, had passed. He was well in age. She was well in age. They had given up. But the Lord sent Gabriel, an angel, to tell them the good news that he had answered their prayers and they were going to get a son. But not only were they going to get a son, but they were going to get John the Baptist. They were going to be included in God's plan of salvation. And so my point last week is that don't give up on your prayers. Don't give up on your prayers. Don't give up on God's promise in your life. You may have to wait. You ain't the first one who had to wait. Abraham had to wait. We're going to talk about how David had to wait today. And Elizabeth and Zacharias had to wait. But when they waited, look what they got. They got John the Baptist. They got not only a son, but a famous son. And that's just how good God is. So keep praying and don't give up. Now, this week, we are in the book of 2 Samuel. We will be talking about David. So let me just set the lesson up real quickly. We are going back in time. Last week we were in around the 6th, 7th BC. We're going to go back 1,000 years in the past. And I'm going to do a quick setup, just give you a historical context and bring you to where we are. And so, when we talk about promise, our lesson, God's promise to David, okay? Kind of start with the promise to Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would have a son and so many other blessings in this promise. And so Abraham did have a son. He had Isaac, and Isaac had twin boys, Jacob and Esau. And the blessing went through Jacob. Jacob then had 4 wives. And of those 4 wives, he had 12 sons and a daughter. And they all migrated to Goshen, and which was near Egypt. And they stayed there for 400 years and they eventually became slaves to the Egyptians. And they cried out to God, and God delivered them. We talked a lot about this in our last quarter, how God delivered them and began to establish this nation, the nation of Israel. And as he delivered them, they wandered in the wilderness, but they finally settled in the promised land. And God had told them, when you go in, wipe all the inhabitants out, but they didn't. And so they just kind of sat on the land with them. And so there was always chaos and conflict and wars. And so the Lord set up judges to help them kind of in their strategic battles, and then they got tired of the judges. The Lord had judges because he wanted to be their leader. He didn't want them to be like other nations. Other nations had kings, and he didn't want them to have a king because he knew what a king would do and what that meant. But they wanted a king. We want to be like everybody else. We want a king. Give us a king. So the Lord gave them a king. Saul was the first king of Israel. But Saul didn't do so well. He disobeyed. And God wasn't having it. So God rejected him and anointed David. And David was a young boy when he was anointed. And so this lesson is about David, but not the beginning of David's reign, sort of in the middle of David's reign. So David it took him 15 years. He was anointed king, but it took him 15 years to become king. But that was only a portion of Israel. The kingdoms was split. It was years later where he became the king of all of them. So this was promised to him, but he had to wait for it. So once he became king, his role was to secure the land. So he had to have battles with all of the people who were on the land, the Philistines, the Amalekites, the Jebusites. He even had to fight the previous king Saul. So he was always at battle. So he was a man of war. And so when things settled down, he built him a beautiful palace, a beautiful home of cedar. And he looked and he saw the Ark of the Covenant. And he says, I want to build a house for the Lord. I want to build a house for and house the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was very important, very, very important to the children of Israel. And whenever they had it, it was the presence of God. When they had it in their possession, they were successful in battle. They were prosperous. So it was very, very important. And so as we begin our lesson, David is contemplating and desiring to build a house for the Lord, to put the Ark of the Covenant in, and he shares it with Nathan. And Nathan says, go ahead, sure, go ahead. Things are settled down. Go ahead and build. And so this is where our lesson starts. So if you have your favorite translations, we are in the 7th chapter of 2 Samuel. We will read the 4th through the 16th verse. And so if you're ready, let's get started. Verse 4. But that same night the Lord said to Nathan, okay, so the night that Nathan gave the okay, the Lord spoke to him. Go and tell my servant David that this is what the Lord declared. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? I have never lived in a house. From the day I brought the Israelites out of Israel until this very day, I have always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet no matter where I have gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to the Israelite tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people Israel. I have never asked them, why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house? Now go, verse 8, and say to my servant David, this is what the Lord of heaven armies have declared. I took you from tending the sheep in the pastures and selected you to be leader of my people, Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. And I will provide a homeland for my people, Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed my judges to rule over my people Israel. I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house of you. He will make a house of you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make a kingdom, his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, verse 14, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod, like any father would do. But my favor will never be taken from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I remove from your sight. Verse 16, your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. That's the reading. Isn't that interesting? And so we see the Lord is correcting this and asking the question, are you the one to build my house? I've never asked for any. It's been hundreds of years, and I have not asked any of the elders to build me a house. I'm happy. I strategically planned this. I gave details to your forefathers how to build the tabernacle because I wanted to dwell among my people. I wanted to walk with them. I wanted to dwell among them. I wanted to guide them and protect them and provide for them and discipline them when necessary. And so the Lord didn't want David. It wasn't the right time. David was a man of war. And he was giving David a promise. So let's talk about that promise, because the subject of our lesson is God's promise to David. And let's just take our time and talk about this promise. So he begins as he pivots from asking the questions to Nathan and sharing that information to David. He pivots and he begins to share with David what his plans are. And he says, you were a shepherd, and I raised you to lead my people. I took you from the lowliest position, and I elevated you to the highest position. And I was with you. Everywhere you went, I was with you. I helped you defeat your enemies, and I've made you a great king. But this is what I'm really going to do for you. I'm going to make a house for you. Because David loved the Lord, and he cared about the things of the Lord. And God knew the intents of his heart. And so because of his desire to build the house, the Lord made him a house, made a house of him, made him a legacy and a dynasty of kings. And that this promise was going to extend all the way to Jesus Christ. So let's just take a look at this. So in contrast, David started in a lowly position, was elevated. God was with him. All of his enemies were defeated. The Amalekites, the Philistines, the Jebusites. Saul, he was anointed as king, but he had to wait 15 years or more. But God preserved him. During that time, he preserved him through that promise. He promised to make his name great, that he would be famous. And so, this David, we know the story, David and Goliath, all those stories we all learned. For those of us who went to Sunday school, we learned about David, how courageous he was, King David. In fact, we have the Star of David. In fact, on Monday of this week, we had an event at the Oakland Community Center. And there was a woman there. I had never met her before. And she introduced herself to me. And I noticed she had 2 Star of Davids on her neck, and one was a small Star of David, and one was a really solid gold one. And I said, "Oh, your necklaces are beautiful. Your Star of Davids are beautiful." And she says, "Yeah, one is my mother's." And I'm like, "I bet I can guess which one is your mother's, the bigger one." She said, "Yes." But so my point is that we still talk about David. David is famous, King David, and so the Lord said that he would make him a giant in history. And his dynasty, a dynasty of kings to lead Israel. And he would, and so at this particular time, David had about 6 sons, and he knew none of them were going to be kings. They just didn't have it. But the Lord saying, I'm going to raise up a son that has not been born yet. And through him, he is going to build my temple. And I'm going to be a father to him. And I'm going to discipline him when he needs disciplining. But I will never take my favor from him like I took from Saul. Saul's dynasty was cut off. But David's dynasty, because of this promise, lived in and will live into eternity. And because, now I want to make this point. There were times, I want you to really understand this promise, and I really want you to understand that the promises of God, it doesn't matter what happens. When God gives you a promise, he can fulfill that promise. David had then Solomon. Solomon had sons that sat on thrones, but there were times in Israel history where there was no king at all. They even were in exile. They were taken off their land. But God kept descendants. He kept the descendants of David. In fact, when you think of Bethlehem, another name for Bethlehem is the city of David, because David's descendants lived there. His family lived there. So when Mary and Joseph went, when Mary was pregnant with baby Jesus, they went to Bethlehem to register. They didn't stay in an inn. They stayed with relatives. It's just that the homes there were so many people in town. You had a room where you cook in and maybe you sleep in. Then you had a guest, because having guests was real important in that day. Hospitality was huge in that day. So they all had a guest room. And so the people that Mary and Joseph stayed with, they already had guests. So they had to sleep in a room where the animals were. And that's where we get the story. And so my point is that the descendants, God allowed the descendants to stay. So even when there wasn't no king, there were the descendants. And then Mary was a descendant of David, and Joseph was a descendant of David. And so then Jesus was born, a descendant of David. And Jesus, his father being David and his father being God, an eternal promise. This is I'm making David a house. Is him being on the throne forever, or his lineage being on the throne forever. Now, David did not live to see the full promise, but the promise happened. We have it on record in the scripture. We have it on record. And just now, I was thinking about this lesson. I thought about when Abraham got his promise. He had a son, and he thought that his son Ishmael was going to have the blessing. But the Lord said, no, a son that is coming, a son that is Isaac is coming. And just like David had all these sons. He knew they weren't going to be kings. But the Lord said, no, a son that is coming. And so when you look at these promises, I don't want you to give up on your prayers. I don't want you to give up on the promises. I want you just to know, if you just wait, God will make things great for you. He will make things great for you. And so he promised, and he fulfilled his promise. And I just want to make sure I have covered all my notes. God's son, David's son. And so let's read, what an amazing story. What an amazing story. Let's read the aim of the lesson. God will fulfill his promises. The fact is to show that when David sought to build a temple for God, God instead promised to build a dynasty for him and an eternal kingdom ruled over by his son, the eternal king. The principle of the lesson is to show that the coming of Christ was in keeping with God's covenant with David, a covenant that pointed the way toward the Messiah's arrival. The application of our lesson this week is to show that as God prepared for the coming of Christ by the means of his covenant with David, we can be assured that he is in control of history and that all that he has promised will come to pass. Stand on his promises. Our conclusion: God revealed to David a narrowing of his focus for sending the Messiah. The coming Redeemer would be a king of David's descent and would reign from his throne forever. Now, next week, we will examine the unfolding of God's covenant with David through the birth of Christ and the king whose reign will one day be fully manifest. So we'll be back in Luke. Just read the first chapter of Luke if you haven't read it. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson. It is amazing. Standing on God's promises, not giving up, continuing to pray. Please share this message with someone. Like, subscribe, leave your comments. And thank you for those who left comments last week. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. Until next week, I'm excited to hear what else we'll learn. Thank you.